Welcome to our 50th season of Basic Black. Some of you are joining us on our broadcast, and others of you are joining us on Facebook. I'm Callie Crossley, host of Under the Radar 89.7. Joining me tonight, Juan Carlos Morales, co-chair of Massachusetts United for Puerto Rico. He is also the managing partner at Surfside Capital Advisors. Julio Ricardo Varela, co-host of In the Thick, a national political podcast. Dr. Pedro Reina-Pérez, director of Harvard University's Puerto Rico Winter Institute and a professor at the University of Puerto Rico. And Phillip Martin, senior investigative reporter, WGBH News. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you, Callie.
Well, some of us were gathered here 2 days after, or 2 weeks actually, after the hurricane hit last year, and it was so present and so emotional. We're right here just looking at everything that happened. And I thought maybe a good question to start with would be to ask each of you, what one thing do you think has dramatically made a difference in the 7 months since the hurricane hit? Let's start with you, Juan.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I've been to the island now 3 times since the Hurricane Maria events. And I got to tell you, it's clear to me that the situation is still precarious, but some improvement has been shown. You have the power grid very fragile, still spotty in its performance, but for the most part, a large part of the population is now getting electricity. You have a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel in terms of the tourism industry coming back. And one of the things that remain most challenging is, in my view, if you take the political condition and the economic condition, I just think we have a very long journey ahead in terms of the recovery period.
I think, awareness, like it's now, as a journalist, as someone who has been covering Puerto Rico for more than, for decades, like I've never in my time have experienced such interest in where I'm from. And that's kind of like a double-edged sword, because there's a part of me that's like, where have you been? Because these issues that that we're starting to talk about, the economic crisis and the power grid and things, or the political situation, that didn't start on September 20th, 2017, when Hurricane Maria literally, destroyed Puerto Rico in a lot of ways. So I have always said, I've always looked at this as Puerto Rico will always now be, what was it like before Hurricane Maria? Mm-hmm. And what's it after? And that journey, that path, wherever, is literally happening every day, and we don't know where it will wind up. But because there is, here we are, months later, and you guys have done the second, you're doing another show.
Yeah.
And,
right.
And people call me now and say, let's talk about the situation or relationship to the United States. So there's a part of me that's is excited about that, but I also think that we can't forget that there's a human toll, that people have been living under very, very tough conditions for months, and questions of, mental health, and those things are really starting to hit me a lot more.
Professor?
Resiliency. April 20th marked the 7-month anniversary of the hurricane, and it's still incredible. People have pulled together, but when I go to the university, for example, we're still living and driving without traffic lights.
Right.
They're slowly coming back, but there's one intersection across from the university and the biggest student parking lot, and it's still not working. So students every day have to hustle to not be hit by cars, because there's simply still a level of chaos that people have adapted to. But in spite of that, I think resiliency is something that has struck me, because people have put their lives back together.
Phillip?
Political impact. And part of that is, to echo what Julio said, is the many Americans on the mainland are just discovering that there are Americans living in Puerto Rico, that these are American citizens. And some of those American citizens are now living in states that are going to make a big difference in the midterm elections.
And some are living here, too, in
some here,
Massachusetts.
exactly. Maybe not to the degree that we have thought in places like Florida, But certainly to various degrees around the country, that population will make a huge difference. And that awareness manifests from NBC News reports about what was happening. NBC spent, I think, a good amount of time talking about the situation in Puerto Rico and what it meant systemically in Puerto Rico and what it meant for people living in the continental United States. I thought that was very important. Latino USA and Latino Rebels. All of these were very instrumental in putting a spotlight on the island of Puerto Rico and its citizens who are American citizens. And that it was very important. The President of the United States came to realize through this episode that Puerto Ricans are American citizens. And so I find this to be very important, and how it might manifest in elections, not just the midterm elections, but elections here on, those who continue to stay in the United States, I think will have a major impact. And what's as important is that politicians know that. Politicians in Florida realize that this is not just something you can ignore, a population that you can ignore. Heretofore, that might have been the case for some of them, assuming that Puerto Ricans would not vote. I think we are, because of the situation, it wasn't just a disaster in Puerto Rico, it was a catastrophe. Those are two technically different things. And I think that that realization that the people who experience that are now living in these areas will have a major impact on those politicians who want their votes.
Yeah. But I just want to say to that point, what I'm finding in some of my reporting is that people are kind of like, by escaping catastrophe, and there is awareness in the United States, and I totally agree, but people are kind of like, I got to rebuild my life.
Well, that's right.
And like voting, like, so
voting is second.
Like political organizations,
Right.
It's very fascinating in the diaspora where I'm talking to these leaders, like, is what I mean is like, we don't know what the journey of Puerto Ricans are yet politically, because I think we're all kind of reassessing it. And also like a post-catastrophe being like, you're literally coming out of the haze, and you're like, whoa. So I think one of the biggest mistakes that both Republicans and Democrats need to be careful is that they're not going to just be like, oh, Trump is bad, he threw paper towels at me.
Right.
What needs to happen is a better, deeper understanding of the political issues, the territorial relationship, the colonial status of Puerto Rico, and understand that those issues are American issues that need to get dealt with politically. And those politicians that kind of wake up to that, I think, are going to be the ones that people are going to pay attention to.
I agree with that. Absolutely.
So, Professor Reina-Pérez, I'm particularly interested in your take on, because you're talking about some forms of normalization. It's a resilience to see that it's here and we have to deal with it, so we push forward. But it also means it normalizes the situation. And last week, the power outage across the island, now I want everybody to understand it wasn't one piece of the island, because that's been happening off and on, where a little part goes out. And there's some people who still haven't had electricity. But this was the entire island as it was when the hurricane first hit.
Exactly. For many people, it was a surprise, because we've had blackouts throughout. But this was the one blackout that was, all across the island. I remember I was sitting in my office at the university, and we lost power. And within 10 minutes, I had my students, their relatives were texting from the other side of the island, there's no electricity here. So eventually, we caught on to the fact that this was bad. And not long after, we were told it was going to take somewhere between 12 and 36 hours for power to come back. The funny thing is, a lot of people started hearing generators. We were talking about generators before. And for some of them, it was like a trigger. Hearing so many generators at the same time was something really unnerving, and they kept writing and talking about it, like going, what is this? Is this going to happen again? How long? And I think it points to the fact that the grid is still very fragile, and so is the economy, because if you have businesses, schools, and hospitals, depending on electricity, every time the power goes out, it sends like a huge message that things, could turn for the worse. So it puts people on edge, and I suspect that until we get something more stable, we're going to see people, kind of hesitant of moving forward, because, the hurricane season is around the corner, and people are not fearful of another hurricane. They're fearful of a tropical storm that could wreak havoc on the entire island.
I want to take a moment to hear from the head of the university at the University of the Virgin Islands, because that's also an American property. We haven't heard much. There's much smaller population than Puerto Rico. To just give a sense of, in general, what the rebuilding process has been like, and when we come back, then I want to pick up on some other financial issues.
I think the territory has made tremendous progress. Right after the hurricane, there was only about 25% of the island that had power. We're now in the high 90 percentile of people who have power. There's still obvious examples of traffic lights not being present and other sorts of things, but at least that aspect is present. Many of the homes that the roofs came off, they're now temporary roofs, and people are, at least for the most part, able to live in their homes. There is a tremendous, what I would call, emotional and psychological scar from having gone through this experience, and we're trying to be supportive of people on that level as well. I am encouraged that our staff and faculty have worked hard throughout the last 7 months so that we were able to not only save this academic year for our students who will be graduating, some of them in about 2 to 3 weeks. The university was hit extremely hard, especially by Irma. We lost about 10 buildings across both campuses. We have a campus on St. Thomas and one on St. Croix. But it certainly had a critical impact on the territory. There are numerous individuals who lost their homes, were without power, without all of the basic things that we have all grown accustomed to. And it took a Herculean effort on the part of the officials in the territory and federal officials and the Army that came in to take care of people at the kind of intense time. We tried to do the same thing with our employees through a UVI Rise relief fund that we created because of the size of the Virgin Islands, population of just over 100,000 versus Puerto Rico that has 3 million residents. It's very easy for, especially in the public's mind, for us to be a footnote to this entire experience. Both of our hospitals were destroyed. And a number of patients had to be placed off island. A lot of schools were destroyed as well, and so some parents sent their children to live with relatives off island. And so there's a consequence from that as well. So there are numerous consequences that we have suffered, and this is in no way to make light of what has happened in Puerto Rico. It is also extremely affected, and even now they are still having these blackouts because of loss of power. So in that respect, we are in a better position because though we still have challenges periodically with power, it's not at the level in which it's happening at Puerto Rico right now. Both territories need to be cared for and need to be in the minds of people in the mainland and around the world.
So, very similar kinds of circumstances, smaller population, but what it leads me back to is a recovery fund. I'm sorry, Phillip, yes?
Yeah, I'm thinking recovery fund, but I think what both of these situations seem to also what seem to emphasize is also what happened even before these catastrophes. And I'm thinking about, you think about the Virgin Islands. The 3 islands basically have been saddled with this massive debt for years, a debt of about $2 billion, greater per capita than even in Puerto Rico. And so even when they recover, if you will, ostensibly recover, they are still saddled with a massive problem, and that basically manifests in terms of income inequality. You see that throughout the Virgin Islands, and you see it in Puerto Rico. So it's not just a question of dealing with this, with the catastrophe, the effects of the catastrophe, but it's dealing with some of the underlying issues that basically have governed both of these places in terms of how folks live from day to day. And I think that's one of the in one way it's as a result of these catastrophes, this disaster, people are looking at that more forthrightly. But the question becomes what actually will occur in terms of actually reining in both debt and addressing the cause of that debt and how it's basically distributed unequally amongst people in both Puerto Rico and in the Virgin Islands.
Well, let me pick up and say they may be looking at it more forthrightly, but most of the commentary is about how people are going to pay their debt.
Right.
They're not really trying to figure out what was happening before or understanding that there was some inequity happening, which then built upon it. So the reason I wanted to bring up the recovery fund is that just to make clear to people that Congress did pass recovery funds in last year for Florida, for Texas, and for Puerto Rico. The amount that was passed by Congress was $4 billion, and then it got halved with no explanation to $2 billion.
Right.
And by the way, it's a loan, not a grant.
That's a big point. It's a loan.
Yeah, if I can just interject, I mean, I think you've hit the nail in the head, right? And this is a very complex problem that I'm about to oversimplify, right? But we need to develop a long-term holistic solution that allows for capital to get attracted to the island again, right? And capital comes in the form of federal funds as well as in the form of the private sector capital. Right now, that is not the environment in Puerto Rico. And until that gets fixed, any idea that gets put on the table will struggle, right? So, I plead to the politicians, both federally and locally in Puerto Rico, that should rise to the occasion and say, all right, how do we come up with a viable long-term economic plan that has the ability to put back trust in the system, right? And right now there is no trust.
Right, and then you take that with the fight, the resiliency point you make, but also like when people heard the generators,
right,
like the trigger, like that borders stress, traumatic stress, mental health, and there's a reason why, suicide hotlines increased dramatically.
Well, suicides are
calls,
up.
right?
Yeah. Yes.
But the people are calling, and like the Times did a great piece, so it's a balance because long term, but then.
What happens now?
Yeah, the generators came on and I got triggered and I got bad memories and like what's going on, and maybe it's time for me to leave. I might come back, because one of the things that people aren't talking about is that people are actually coming back.
Wibbly wobbly.
Yeah, the people are coming back.
In large numbers? Or?
Well, I think, after you're there for 4 or 5 months, you're like, well, it's not a large number, but I also think like there's enough stories when you're starting out and you're in Kissimmee, Florida, or in Orlando, or wherever, and, you're starting a new life,
right?
And sometimes that, sometimes that could be scary, but at the same time, the mortgage crisis that's happening, people are now can't afford their homes.
Yeah.
So are people going to leave then? And it goes back to my point: is that this is all now mushed together, and I honestly don't know where Puerto Rico is going to be in 5 to 10 years.
Right, certainly trending downwards. I'm a finance person by background, and I always tell, we have not found a trough. Every cycle has a peak and a trough, right? And there are other jurisdictions in the world, whether it's Greece or Detroit or DC area, that have been through traumatic financial situations that we are faced with, right? I think the challenge with this one is that the political environment is so complex. We have not found our footing, right? So it's going to keep spiraling and spiraling and spiraling until we find the footing. At that point, you may have a viable political solution, an economic solution that calls for the restructuring of the debt, creating incentives, working alongside with the federal government to attract private capital, right? And, but these things could take 5, 10, 15 years because we haven't found our footing.
One thing that is still needed is a plan for economic development.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right.
They're counting on the federal monies. They're counting on the insurance payments.
There is no plan.
And that'll, drive you so long. There is no viable plan right now. People are still reeling from learning that the board is imposing a labor reform.
Fiscal board. Yes.
The fiscal board, a labor reform
Pension,
that will
cuts.
touch, the people's pensions, minimum wage. And it's, people are stunned to learn that it's not only public employees that are going to pay the price, but also private sector employees. So until a plan is put forth, we're basically dealing in hypotheticals.
And plan means hope, right? And when I think there's a lot of people in Puerto Rico that are beginning to feel hopeless, right? And that creates a tremendous amount of talent and people that are leaving the island, which further exacerbates the problem.
That's the point. The point I'm saying with the brain drain, because we are a bilingual, bicultural people, and I always say we're very attractive to businesses. And one of the things that Puerto Rico lacks is right now is how are you taking care of that younger, educated, that core of bilingual, bicultural kids, younger than my generation, to be what are you going to do next? So you are seeing pockets of entrepreneurship, people that, at least in the digital space where the people are doing work. But what's missing is sort of this bigger, what's the vision for the island? The problem with that as well is, and it's because the elephant's in the room, is we still haven't figured out our political status.
That's it.
And colonialism, once the colonial mind, is a hell of a drug, because we aren't good enough sometimes to self-criticize ourselves as a community, to be this whole thing of vision. It's oh no, there's a lot of Puerto Ricans we can't rock the boat.
But that vision has to include, and I think this is pivotal. Getting back to this whole notion of development, if capital and when capital arrives in a different form or in greater form, if you will, to Puerto Rico post hurricane, it still has to. You have to find a way to basically involve all of the people of Puerto Rico, and this is true of the Virgin Islands too. When you see in the Virgin Islands, where you have a lot of tourism money that was pouring into the Virgin Islands, but the people, many people on the ground level, some of the poorest people, never see the greater impact of those tourist dollars, and that's true in Puerto Rico too, in terms of a vast assortment of industry, far greater, of course, than that of the Virgin Island territories. And so part of that vision that you're talking about has to include ways of distributing resources more equitably in Puerto Rico. That is that's the crux of the problem pre-hurricane and post-hurricane. That you have to basically involve. That everyone has to benefit from the resources that are coming into the islands.
And I would add to that if you were to ask me what makes Puerto Rico now different than the other U.S., certainly continental U.S., right? What is our poorest state? I would argue probably Mississippi, Louisiana on a per capita basis, right? The wealth gap in Puerto Rico is trending way lower than Mississippi and Louisiana. And I'm telling you, I've lived in Massachusetts for the last 20 years, but I did have the opportunity to live in Mexico City one year. And it's beginning to remind me of a very Latin American, typical American country, which you have a lot of people that are, taking advantage of being in the top 5%, right? And a poor class, which is growing and growing, and a middle class that is slowly disappearing, right?
And Puerto Rico had and that's the scary thing about all this, is that Puerto Rico had a middle class, a very vibrant middle class in the 60s and 70s and the 80s. And it's just, that's the big question here. It's sad.
Well, I mean, I think in the context of this fiscal board, to me, and then I just heard from a Wall Street, I guess a Bloomberg story about the Wall Street people buying up these bonds.
It's a great time to buy if you are a Wall Street quote-unquote vulture, right? Because valuations are historically lows, and, there are various hedge funds that took positions before the hurricane.
Right.
Because of the economic, bond-related issues. Those valuations are even lower now, right? So if you are a patient investor, right, I think Puerto Rico is a good place to put money right now, because you have to be patient, right? But to me, our politics are local. And I'd like to spend, if I may, 2 minutes on the Mass United for Puerto Rico Fund.
You're going to spend that on the other side of this break. I just want to say, I just wanted to thank you all for this part of the conversation. We're going to continue on Facebook, because this is the end of our broadcast. And thanks to all of our guests for joining us. And we need to continue the conversation. We will be continuing on Facebook about Puerto Rico.